Why don't we open this up to the audience, and maybe just to start it, I could ask one of my former colleagues from the Economic Bureau, Harry Kopp, who's written, you've written a book on commercial diplomacy, Harry, and I think you may have a new edition coming out. But if you have any observations or questions you'd like to put on the floor.
I guess the first observation I'd make, Sean, is that I've heard a lot of this before, going back to the early days of my career in the late 60s and early 70s. We heard a lot about, we were on an export drive then because of what we thought were balance of payments problems. Little did we know
what a balance of payments problem was.
What a real trade deficit would look like. But debates about what is a U.S. company.
Right.
Those have been going on for 30 years. We debated the importance of functional bureaus and tried to elevate them. The idea that the Undersecretary for Economic Affairs should have a scope of control that includes the environment and energy. Well, that's the way it was before
the G was created,
multiplied, before there was this sort of metastasizing of undersecretaries. So you go. There's a wave of consolidation and then separation. These organizational questions don't seem to come to grips with the real problem, which is that the U.S. government has a hard time figuring out how to promote business overseas and specifically how to promote exports without falling into a mercantilist trap that every administration has resisted for many, many years. These are, I'm not sure that we're seeing a new day. I think we're seeing the same issues still being debated in really basically the same terms as they have been debated for 30 years.
Chuck, you're on the inside now. Al and I are outsiders. Any thoughts?
Harry, in large part, maybe when I was talking about my reflection as I was leaving service a year or so ago, that was kind of, things are still going this way and the world has changed dramatically. What I do see with the stretch target a president has set for you, which always, I think, focuses your attention to double export. And I welcome it. I don't see that as some kind of an artificial thing. It really is a moment to look at this again. And I think now, a year into it, where you probably have gone through all the old issues about as much as you can, there is a very important churning going on, I believe, to look at, well, what would we be doing going forward that would allow us to have a more dynamic export-led growth sector. And I think that leads you to this connectivity to something called competitiveness, which is much on everyone's mind. And whether it's some think tanks in town that have put out some studies or some discussion, I know that when I'm hearing it now for the first time in a while, I'm not hearing just this kind of trap of the export. Let's help that exporter. I use the data of the one going to 58% or 60% go to one market. And it's kind of how to look at supporting business in a way that would recognize the broader thing we need to do to have the competitiveness. The broad vision of that would include education, infrastructure, a whole range of issues that get around perhaps why the American economy is not the other thing that's coming into play, which I welcome, is inward investment. That's a different angle from the federal government. How does the federal government and the states and local government tackle, once again, the issue of attracting inward investment? Again, these are new features, I think, that I see beginning to emerge. What I was suggesting with some of the companies like Life Sciences and some of the some of the new energy businesses, how can we get off of the fact that so much, we might be actually supporting a product where much of it's made in Taiwan or China, but we've got a stake in it that's at least something we can understand. There's a U.S. interest in this, and get away from the kind of widget being sold to country X, and how do we help that company do it? So it's, I'm just sharing with you some perspective that I've had in these 4 months back, is a very welcome looking at the export challenge within this broader context of competitiveness in the American economy, which will produce, I think, a vigorous debate as to what's the government's role in that, in terms of tax policy, regulatory policy, and a range of things. But I welcome it because I think it gets us out of a world we're not really in anymore, given globalization of these kind of nation states merely exporting and our focus on small and medium-sized companies to export from one market to the other.
Sean,
it's a challenge for our programs.
if I could, I think
Yeah.
Chuck makes some great points, and I'd like to just add to the list, I guess, quickly. 5 quick points, I think. One, I think as we develop a more comprehensive national export strategy, it has to involve macroeconomic measures like cutting the deficit dramatically and reorienting this whole way resources are allocated away from consumption towards investment and export. Second, I think we have to recognize that as important as manufactured exports are, that a lot of our exports are going to be in the service and sort of invisibles, and we have to protect those. And part of that means not allowing counterfeits of things that are produced at great cost and with great innovative skill in the United States when they are exported and find their way to other countries. Third, I think, this may be my Transparency International hat coming out, but I think that bribery and corruption are drags on our exports and competitiveness. That is bribery and corruption practiced by other countries. I think it's a good news that some of these countries are beginning to develop laws. I think we need to work hard to get them to be enforced. It's sort of a good governance policy, but it's also part of a national export strategy. I think we need to be more aggressive in negotiating and implementing trade agreements. I'm not trying to take pot shots at anyone. I know firsthand how difficult these issues are, but when you have agreements that lower barriers abroad to our stuff, for countries that already have low barriers in our country to the exports of their stuff, I think.
And the rest of the world is moving to liberalize. We're sitting on the sidelines is
so you have to you have to do that. And fifth and last, I just reiterate and reemphasize the point that Chuck made about inward investment. When other countries are willing to put their hard-earned money in our country to work for us and to provide jobs for our workers, that's pretty much always going to be, not always, but pretty much most of the time, that's going to be a good thing. And we ought to welcome it and support it.
Well, and I would add outward investment as well. I think that I'm a little disappointed that this administration has been so hesitant on bilateral investment treaties, and I realize it's a challenging issue politically, but I think in a global economy, for our companies' abilities to succeed and create jobs here at home, they need to be players globally, and investing abroad is part of that.